this is what happens when God says, okay, you guys don't like the way I was running it. You want to run it for yourself? You run it. And when we do that, and we do it without God's guidance, then we end up building a society where temptation is at the forefront all the time. In a godly society, you don't have, commercial temptation to do evil. You don't have job-related temptation to do evil. You don't have familial relation temptation to do evil. All that stuff is encouraging you to do good. And I think that's the delta that we see between our, like, here's what I want to do inside that's good, but my outside causes me to do this. I say again to the young men, whenever they ended up in trouble with, lust turning into actual action on their part that they didn't want to participate in, it would be, I would ask them to walk the logic chain back of how did you get here? And what they would say was, I'd end up in a mental state where it felt very difficult to say no, or almost impossible to say no. But that mental state didn't start then. It started in the car, and that started earlier. And some of them are careful enough to be able to track it back to say, I saw an advertisement today that got me thinking about this for 10 or 15 minutes. And then that thought pattern didn't leave them. And then they go on this date this night, and then it turns into action that they didn't want. They would say to themselves, I did not want to have taken that action. But they will go back and point to this. So if you imagine that doesn't happen, like if, take a young man and he walks into the room and his, supposed eventual paramour just standing there with no clothes on and says, like, let's go. Like, most of them will turn around at that point and be like, nope, I'm back out of it. They don't, if presented with the choice with no ramp up, they make the right choice. It takes the long ramp up in order to get many of them into that position who have the moral desire not to do that kind of thing. So that to me leads me to believe that a significant portion of our yielding to temptation, the temptations we face at all, have to do with the society in which we live that multiplies temptations and provides them consistently along the line. Now, we don't have enough data to say that's solely it, but philosophically speaking, that's where I come down. Lang, were you saying something, brother? Okay, I guess we'll get started. We're already started. You did this to me, didn't you?
I did, sorry.
Sorry. All right. Where we left off, with your permission, we'll shut down class about 10 minutes early, if that's okay. I'm gonna run and got signed up for. Be careful when you have kids, because I volunteered to be an assistant coach at a sport that I've never played in my life. And I show up, and the guy that's supposed to be the head coach says to me the day that practice starts, he's like, oh yeah, my son's not playing for the team anymore. He's playing for this other team, so I can be here on practice days, but you'll have to take the games and the practices.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I'm like, objection. I don't know. Like, I see there's sticks and there's nets and something about skates, but like it's a little fuzzy after that point. So I got made the head coach of a semi-travel team, and we're winning consistently because we have an overpowered goalie who's about 20% taller than everybody else he's supposed to be, so he fills the net, and he's really good and he practices all the time. So it's a good day.
Oh, yeah, that's the place to have the big guy.
I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm literally like, go get them, boys. Well done. Good defense. How do you know that was good defense? I have no idea. It didn't go in the net. That must have been good defense. It is comical. If you ever want to see what it looks like to absolutely fake your way to acting like you're in charge and knowing what you're doing, come watch me coach hockey. It is 100% a lie. Other than encourage, I just encourage. I try to encourage. Okay. We left off in this view, and the question was, how much do we choose our own identity? And I think it's safe to say, I think I can make a few non-controversial statements. Because of where the context in which we're born, we don't have an infinite range of choices about who we can be. Okay, so there's some constrained, a number of possibilities, you could say, or feasibilities of what you could be. And you are at least respond, whether it was God that set it up, whether it was quote unquote nature that set it up, or something like that. In this room we would say God set it up. It's God that set it up, but we basically get to choose from what God provided. Let's say it this way: it is possible for us to make choices in response to what God provided. God made you born a male, but it could be the case that you can choose to say, I don't choose to identify as male, I can choose to identify as female. So that's a choice that you can make, but it's in response to what you were given initially. You don't get to turn around and say, I want to back up in time, or here I am at the point of being conceived, I'm going to choose what my sex is, right? So that those options are not to us. Those are delivered upon us. Our parents are delivered upon us, like our society we live in, the time, all that stuff. So we make choices about who we are in response to empirical, to physical, ontological data and metaphysical data that we are given. So everything, we are in the response version of this, not the making version of this. We lack the power to make ourselves from zero. So every choice that we make about identity is in response to. There cannot be any from zero choices, because unless we're going to say our identity is completely decoupled from the rest of these things, which is a move we can make. What you can do is say something like this: I am not a man. I am not a 20th century born man. I'm not an American man. I can say I am this particular soul or will that just so happens to be instantiated at this time. But Freaky Friday style, you could have pulled me out and stuck me back in the medieval period, and I would have been exactly who I am. Now, if you're going to say that, then this doesn't have anything to do with who you are, your identity. So this is why, this consideration is why I've been pressing us towards the question of what is the essential identity. Like, we can make property statements all the time about, here's some Scottish dude. But is that really who I am? Or does that just happen to be the shell in which I was put? So if that's really who I am, that leads us down one set of considerations. We're in this only response phase. If it's the case that no, you're taking the viewpoint that you could be dropped in anywhere and still be the same person, then you can get rid of all that, and the only thing you're responding to is existence. God made you exist. Now, you do have an option, famously, to be or not to be. That is the question. Shakespeare deals with this in a way that we read it in iambic pentameter, and we think it's supposed to be art. He was actually asking a very key question of, like, do I support my own existence? Or are there times, is there a set of considerations where I say, terminating my own existence is something I ought to do? Much bigger deal back when he was making that question. In Western Europe, suicides went to hell, no further questions, right? So in a world where people believe in heaven and hell, and if you kill yourself, you're in hell, that's a different consideration than we make today. Today it's easy, so to speak, comparatively, because that psychological weight isn't on you. But that wasn't the way they were dealing with it back then. Okay, so yes, sir.
Presumably, can you end your own soul?
Which also depends on your belief about the soul. If you have an eternal soul, then you can't. If your life only began when this body arose and ends when it turns into dust, then yeah, you can kill. Then the soul is inextricably linked to the body, and without the body, the soul doesn't live. If so, then yes, you can. But to your point, that doesn't seem to be what the Bible teaches. The Bible seems to teach that if the soul isn't eternal beforehand, is it at least everlasting this way, with the possible exception of maybe God destroys souls in hell. But for those that don't go to hell, maybe God doesn't destroy souls in hell, and so they're all eternal once created.
On the point of suicide, though, you can kill your physical body. Are you able to kill your soul?
I think that the Christian answer to that is no. So Christian theologically, we would say no. So if we take that to be the case, that choice isn't there. You don't get that option.
Well, the Bible does tell us that God can kill the soul.
Yeah.
Why are you afraid of the man that can kill your body, but not your soul?
This verse is one of the reasons that I'm a person who believes that souls are destroyed in hell rather than tormented eternally.
Does your soul have an identity?
And so here we are. Like, that's the question, right? That's the question we're asking: is it really? Now let's treat.
And
let's
is that
look at
identity separate and distinct from your physical identity?
Right. That's exactly the question we asked earlier. Yes. So consider Tolkien's viewpoint on this one. If you take his mythology, his Lord of the Rings style mythology, as reflective of what he believed about reality. So remember, in his world, if you haven't read his Silmarillion books, he outlines his worldview. He outlines the worldview, including who God is and all that in that thing. So there's God like we would recognize him, this theistic creator of all, but he creates what we would call the angels, what Tolkien calls gods, And they come in levels, kind of like angels do. You have your high-level gods, and then they had like a second-tier god, and then after that it was like elves and people and dwarves and some orcs, and well, I guess he didn't make this. So these higher-level gods, that includes the Satan figure, they end up in heaven singing a song, and the Satan figure says he wants to sing his own song, and so he starts his own counter music, and he gets some people around him confused, and some people choose to join him, and then they end up singing, and it turns into this horrible cacophony, and eventually God, who's singing with them, sings this one deep note, and then he says, I will show you what you have wrought, and he turns their music into reality, and that the reality that we live in is the angels' music that's being put into reality, which is an interesting thought. But the idea behind that, so when he talks about these different beings, he says some of them are spirits of fire, some of them are spirits of something else, and so they have this nature to them at the soul level that is not physical. And in their world, the physical form oftentimes reflected what their spiritual identity was. But the greatest in terms of skill of the elves had such a fiery spirit that when he died, his body turns into ash. And the idea that he talks about, it seems to be that the spirit of this one elf was significantly more intense or something than the other ones. And so it wasn't that he was necessarily an evil guy, but he made some choices that took him down a path that was catastrophic for everybody. But it was, he got in a lot of trouble. But it was in virtue of that, his soul of adamant, so to speak, or fire, coming up against the bad guy who tricked him in a number of ways. So I say all that to at least put out there that there are people who have thought about this enough to write mythology about it, and that their mythology suggests that the souls differ between each other, that it's not some generic, just add water, get soul kind of thing, that there's a difference that God creates in each of them. And then this takes us to the next question, which is similar to the one we've been asking about the physical form, which is, are we reacting to, even in the place where this doesn't matter, you can drop the soul in anywhere. The question is this: would your soul, and think about it in the choices of your own life, would you have been as good or bad as you are today, given any other body in which you had been put? Now, hopefully I'll remember it here in a second, but I saw an example on a podcast or something. Oh, I remember what it was. There's some guy running around now, and I forget his name, who was a former mobster in New York and was responsible for one of the Cosa Nostra families. His dad was a mobster who got a 50-year sentence, was in jail till he was 100, died at 103. He was like a boss or an underboss, and this is his son. And his son was a captain, a capo in the mob. And he was a particularly clever racketeer, and he came up with a way of defrauding the government it doesn't matter. He ran a tax scheme where they basically just built gas stations, didn't pay the tax, knew it would take him 8 months to shut them down, made that money for 8 months, shut it down, opened it up under another business, and the government couldn't keep up with him. And he made $8 million or so a week doing this for the mob. So at any rate, he eventually decides he wants out of the mob life, and he gets out, and then he goes around, and now his job is he became a Christian, and he tells people, I was bad, this is how I'm good, and this is what the mob was like, and he talks about his life in the mob. He said in this little podcast that I was watching, he said, I would not have chosen this life if my dad had not, and his dad didn't initially encourage him to. His dad was like, I'll enable you to become a doctor or whatever else. His dad gets thrown in prison, and he has to come back and kind of take care of the family. And as a result of that, he sees his dad tells him, law enforcement framed me for this. And I think it sounds like law enforcement did frame him, but it was one of those, like, we framed you for this thing because we know you're doing these 20 things and we can't get you for it, so we're going to do this. So he saw law enforcement as the enemy. And as a result of him trying to take care of his family, et cetera, he got into doing stuff. And later he talks with the guy that's talking to him about, I would do things in here that I wasn't comfortable with, but I had to as a result of living in this life. And he was asking the question of, like, am I a bad guy deep down, or am I a good guy? And that was my uncomfort with this is the sign that I was a good guy. And eventually, of course, he becomes a good guy. And I would have said to him, if I had the opportunity to talk to him, based on what you're telling me, man, you're acting like whether you were a good guy or a bad guy was back then. The determination of whether you're a good guy or a bad guy is what you did now, which is you chose to walk on being a bad guy and become entirely a good guy. That's, you know who you are based on where you are now. This is something that in Christianity translates to this. It doesn't matter what you were born, it matters what you choose, because your identity has to do with who you are. Whether you are good or whether you are bad has to do with where you stand, whether, in Paul's terms, whether you persevere to the end. So it sounds like Paul says there were people who legitimately were Christians and then they turn around and walk. Jesus makes it plants, right? Like it's indifferentiable until you see the results, which is these guys, scorched, these guys choked out, these guys produce fruit. So all that background to basically ask this question: that guy, had you dropped, if he said was accurate, he got dropped in a mob family, and as a result ended up doing mob things where he would not have otherwise. Had you dropped him in some good straight-laced Christian family, would he have been a good straight-laced guy and come to the same place? I put it to you. So I have an opinion about this, but I asked you.
It seems like it's still in flux for me, that we have some core identity which grows as we go through life dealing with the body we're in, the time we're in, and the place that we're in.
Yes.
And the people, and those that that's probably the most important part of it, is those who are interacting with us. And so that core identity has a plethora of different places it can end up.
Yes.
Because of other input, no, not the core identity, but the growing. So it seems like there's I don't know if it's two components, but there's one. You start as something that all of the input affects what you're going into, and I guess the biggest input is the director of the whole thing.
Okay, so let me then, I will take us what I think is to what will get us straight to the point. So these are the questions that I've held off on a little bit. Philosophically speaking, I don't know of a way to determine the truth of any truth claim that we make, the veracity of any truth claim that we make about whether we are souls that have infinite variability, or whether we come with essential soul properties that are given to us by God, or whether we can set those properties on our own. Or let's say that it would be that I don't know of a way to do that. So now we have to ask the question, instead of saying, since that's an unknown, how do we respond anyway? Regardless, since it can't be that we are told that, we know that a priori. Posteriori, what determination can we make? Now here's the point, and I'll ask that this is what's determinative, in my opinion, to this one, and this is the important question. And I would like an answer from y'all in general on this one. This question is identical to another question that we ask on another philosophical issue in here that are very tightly related. Remember I said a lot of these philosophical questions, the 20 questions that people ask, they really reduce down to 2 or 3. This is one of the 2 or 3. What choice in your life, moral or otherwise, do you think that you cannot make freely? So that's not
make
freely, right? Have you ever had a choice? The way I've asked it in the other sense is like, when have you ever been tempted in a way, or presented with a moral evil question, where you said, no, I didn't have any choice, I had to do the evil. Like I could not possibly have chosen the good thing. Now the good thing may have resulted in your own death. The good thing may have resulted in something else, but where you tried to choose the good thing, but it's like somehow the steering wheel went left and you were forced to do the evil. Like I reached out for the good, or I I said I'm doing the good, and in fact I was like, nope, I'm doing the evil. Like, where have you ever had the experience where it was not possible for you to choose the good?
Just, go ahead.
I think most of us are tempted to say, oh, that's impossible. You always have a choice. But then there's case studies like the guy who developed a brain tumor that made him desire to spend time with younger people. And he went to the police and says, I have thoughts that are dangerous. You need to lock me up. They don't lock him up because he hasn't done anything. Like, is that a choice? Even though he went to the police and said, you need to stop me. This isn't normal, something's wrong, I don't know what's wrong, and they later discovered his brain tumor. Does that mean he chose evil when he tried to prevent it, told someone, and presumably his body, his biology?
Well, so I have a problem with the presumption there. So the presumably part is like, okay, he was in this control phase, and then he got into a phase where he couldn't. Now I go back to the young men question, and I don't think ladies identify with this one, but I don't know what to do for you ladies, so you just have to imagine. With the guys, when you ask them about sexual temptation, they get to a point where they're so taken over by their brain chemicals almost, that they'll say, at that point, it was extraordinarily difficult. It would have been impossible or extraordinarily difficult for me not to have proceeded with whatever else. That they all, when you press them on it, will admit that it was like, no, technically I could, it's just like, it went from being able to lift a 5-pound weight to being able to lift a 250-pound weight. Technically, I know that I could do it, but it was just so difficult that I didn't. But I've never heard anybody say, no, once I got to this point, I couldn't possibly have stopped. And that, I asked whether the brain tumor guys got the same problem. So I don't know of any brain pressure that inhibits, that it certainly can change the way that judgment and decision making work, but nothing that makes the decision capability completely null. And that's what, so in terms of him going to the police and saying, you need to stop me, in my opinion, that was him saying, I don't want to do what it is that the temptations that I'm being faced with here and the proclivities that I now seem to have. And the fact that he had a variable version induced by a brain tumor, I don't think changes the question. I think that happens with people who are born with same-sex attractiveness, people who are born with the desire to mate with many, many partners rather than people who seem to be like almost built for monogamy, that kind of stuff. But the call to all of the heterosexual ones are the same. I don't care how much you want to be an adulterer or how little you want to be an adulterer. The bottom line is don't be an adulterer. But all of them presumably have the power to do that. And so maybe a guy with level 8,000 testosterone has a harder time with that than the guy with level 0 testosterone does. But it doesn't mean that he can't make the choice. It just means that he's going to be tempted harder and more frequently than this other guy is. So it's the assumption there, the presumably part of like, is there a point that when he sees a kid that the brain tumor's pressure is just like, okay, move hands to do this thing? I don't think so. I think he's still cognitively capable of interrupting that action. I saw another couple of hands. Seth.
Well, does the person with depression like choose to dwell on negative thoughts?
You tell me.
I mean, it seems like it's not.
So,
well, first of all, the assumption we were talking about morally good and sinful actions.
Yes.
And I don't think depression falls into.
Agreed, but let's take depression as a low-grade case study of the idea of like, am I choosing to be depressed or not?
Sure.
How do you cure? What are the ways of curing depression?
Diet, sleep, behavioral modification.
Okay, so there are behavioral ways that we can do this, therapeutic ways that we can do this, and then there are drug therapeutic ways that we can do this. Do the drug therapeutic ways do it entirely themselves? What will the psychiatrist tell you about what the drug does for you?
It'll tell you that it's helping you to make the change yourself.
Yeah, it's not the long-term solution. What you're doing is raising the person out of the depressed state that puts them into this kind of self-spiral that makes it either impossible, and this is the question, impossible or very difficult to then make the lifestyle changes that lead. But when you go and talk to somebody who's depressed, very few of them are depressed for reasons that they can't, like if you were like, why are you sad? I don't know, I'm just sad all the time. Okay, what do you not like about your life? And it turns out that what they don't like about their life is probably the reason that they're depressed, especially if they will dig deeply enough into it. So presumably, if you change these things, and not just change them to anything, if you change them to other things that are going to depress you, if you were depressed because you were poor and life was very difficult, and then you win the lottery, and you're no longer poor, you may be depressed for other reasons, which is people now see you as a giant cash register, and money turns out not to have brought you your happiness. But nobody goes from I was depressed to I found out that God loves and values me, and here's this other lady or man, depending on who you are, that loves me completely and unconditionally, and for those reasons I'm depressed. Right? Find me the person that says that. So to the point, the depressed person could be said to be capable of getting out of it, but in the same way that you can crawl your way out of a very tall ditch. Or I'll back up. Did you know that every single one of you are capable today of running a marathon nonstop? Nonstop. That is without stopping. You can run a marathon at a reasonable pace. I don't mean like walk, just walking pace. Every single one of you can do it.
Pretty slow.
Well, I'm not saying you're going to break the records, but what I'm saying is you can all do it. And I know this from my experience in the military and then personally, of stuff where people absolutely thought they can't do stuff. But when you force them to do stuff, they will do it. And we all know this as when you go to the gym, if you get a personal trainer, you always lift harder. If you go to the gym with a lifting partner, you tend to lift harder. Why? Well, it turns out that your own self-motivation oftentimes is not enough to do it. Now, once in a while, you'll find those borderline psychotic people that can drive themselves to the point where they damage their own body. But it turns out you actually can do it. Just there are limits to how much you should do and still stay, non-damaged. But the bottom line is you can all do that. Most people don't realize the power of their own will. It is significant. And you see this, by the way, when mothers lift cars off of kids, kind of thing, and they don't come back with fractured bones. So mom can lift the car off the kid to, enough to get the kid out from underneath whatever it was. And that was entirely about an adrenaline shock and their own muscles and bones that can do that. Now, maybe you can make some miracle arguments here and there, but it's well enough documented that it seems to not just be miraculous. It seems to be within the capacity of the human being. Yes, sir. Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind, I used to work out a whole lot more on the moving crew. And I'd come home at the end of the day and I'd be exhausted.
Yes.
I felt like I just couldn't help it. There wasn't much I could do. But it dawned on me that if my job went another 2 or 3 hours, that
You still could have done it.
I'd have it in me to keep it. And so it was definitely a psychological thing because I know I can't live that.
So we use this in special operations screening, and we do this. We lie to the indoctrinee, the person that we're testing, and we usually do it something like this. I've told this story before, so I can skip to the end. 6 hours worth of just constant nonstop running with a pack on, doing tasks, all that kind of stuff, and very uncertain because you don't know, you're having to navigate each of your points and you have to figure them out and all that kind of stuff. And then 6 hours into it, you get to a point and you're like, this one ends at the headquarters building of this little, this base. So, and this is where it stops. You're like, and you get to the radio and you have to get the crypto load on the radio and you ring in and they tell you what your next point is. And you plot it on the map and your next point is 20 miles north of where you are, 20 kilometers north of where you were. And it ends back here, which means you were 6 hours of running. You're still got 40 kilometers to go, and that may not be the end of it. And then some guys quit, right? They're like, I don't have it. I'm out of juice. But when you're like, okay, and you get up running, you get a mile down the road, and the guy steps out of the woods. He's like, just kidding, turn around, go back, you're done. So we weren't interested in whether they could go for 9 hours. What we wanted to know was when you think you're at I've given about all that I've got, and they're like, maybe you're half done. For all you know, this could go into next 3 days. Who quits and who doesn't?
And also, this is when I'm sending the crew out on a job.
Yeah.
I always tell them an hour or two longer than I think it's going to go because if it goes,
it's always easier to go shorter. Everybody's happy.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if they get to the job and it looks bigger than what they were expecting 10 minutes earlier,
Morale goes down too.
Yeah, it's like take all the wind goes out of their
Yeah,
It's
that's
great if you're under 50, but I'll tell you, I have a few friends that have died from shoveling snow.
Well-
So they have hit the limit.
Well, let's say when I say you're capable of it, what I mean is most people's bodies that are not
Right.
70 years old
Under
can't do it.
50, that's true.
Right. And I think even the 70-year-old has more to them than they oftentimes
Yeah.
know.
But there are instances, I mean, I personally know two friends that died from shoveling snow. They just.
Yeah, so I'll back up. That was a general measure. I also know men who died at 35 of a heart attack, after
Fix.
doing, right,
The guy on the road running,
right.
Sitting watching TV.
trucking down the road, and fell
So-
off.
In the case of like psychopaths or people in like a manic episode, they end up like hitting someone. Is that a case where it doesn't appear to them at the time as a moral choice?
So this is a commonly raised point, and Seth's right to raise it. And I'm not accusing Seth of not understanding this. The general person out there believes that psychopaths are driven deterministically to do what they do. What's the difference between it? Technically, DSM-4, there's no difference between a sociopath and a psychopath. This has entered the common lexicon. There's actually not a difference. But the difference that splits them in the people who have sociopathic tendencies is they basically divide into two groups. The lower level, the sociopath, what we call commonly the sociopath, is someone who knows what the right thing is to do, but doesn't care. They're just like, yeah, I know that's right, but I'm not going to do it. The psychopath, what do they think?
Just don't see the difference.
They're like, there is no right or wrong. There's what I can do and there's what I can't do. Those are philosophical viewpoints. Now, what I will say is, technically speaking, by that definition, now there's more to it to fit into having this particular set of disorders that are not actually called sociopathy or psychopathy. They have a special name for them. But that now group that DSM-5 puts them in, those are not dependent on the recognition of morality. There are other things in there, but the general facet of this person doesn't recognize that there's right or wrong in some real objectively grounded way, technically applies to the majority of people today. So if you've looked around at the world and you're like, what has gone wrong with the world? It's that technically the base belief of the psychopath has now promulgated through society. And when you ask society, what is right and wrong, society will say what? Anything ranging from
In the mind of the beholder.
whatever, it's in the mind of the beholder, or it's got to be whatever's right or wrong for you. Or, like, no, there is no right or wrong, it's just what we agree upon socially. Well, if it's what we agree upon socially, what prevents somebody within the society from being an edge case member? You're still a member of society. You're just a member of society that knows how to get away with doing what everybody else says is okay to do. So if it's not actually okay, it's whatever's right for you. And for you, like, this guy insulted me and really made me feel bad, and I want him to be dead. And I'm clever enough, and I'm practiced enough, and I'm disciplined enough to make him dead. Then Dexter, I think, I never saw this. Wasn't Dexter a movie about, a TV show about a psychopath that killed people? Like, he wanted to kill people, so he tried to pick good people to kill, people that needed to die anyway.
Yeah, he had moral code. He killed bad guys.
Right, so maybe he was a sociopath almost, but so he recognized moral code, but he recognized a moral code in the ideal, but he didn't feel that he needed to adhere to it necessarily. But he did enough to say, well, since I want to kill, I'll kill these. I probably shouldn't kill, but since I want to kill, I'll kill these guys. So it was maybe it's interesting
Also, so he
philosophical.
wouldn't get caught because no one would miss them.
Right. And so here he is saying I can be that edge case, and there's not anything technically wrong with it. So this should be worrisome, I think. But now let's take all this crazy talk over into the main question, which is, so Seth raises this, the person raises the question of whether our perception of these people acting deterministically is true. Even the psychopath and the sociopath recognize this action is recognized by those people as being evil. I don't think it's evil. I happen to think it's good. Or I don't think that there are categories of good and evil. Those are just controls that people put on people. There's only what a man can't do and what he can't do. And I can do this one, and I can get away with it, and therefore I'm going to do it. But that's a person who doesn't recognize what? There's only one thing wrong with that viewpoint. Because it's not wrong. In one sense, there are things that you can do and you can't do. If there's no God at the end of it, then it doesn't matter. The guy's absolutely right. In fact, Might Makes Right was the moral code a long time ago. So do you know anything about Dahmer? Do you know what Dahmer built in his house? He built a throne to himself. He was God in his own mind. And when you hear him describe, and I wouldn't advise that you do, so you can take my word for it, because it is a dark path that his mind goes down. But he had the stacked skulls and everything. He had decided that he was a God and maybe the God, and that was what he was doing. Wow. So really, I mean, that guy's as edge case as you're going to get. But the point is, he's an edge case that's a part of a curve. And the question is, if it's true of him, how much is of it true of the rest of us? And the dividing line in humanity is only on one line. Either you're working for yourself as God, or you're working for something else as God. And in that something else as God, that could be other gods, it could be false gods, or it could be the true God. But at the end of the day, that's the dividing line in humanity. And maybe the other dividing line is false gods and true God, or sub-gods.
Just a quick brief note on that, like, self-deification issue. Karl Marx, when he was a teenager, wrote poetry that you'd think was Satan talking out of Isaiah.
Yeah.
Saying, like, I will ascend, I will, make myself a throne, I will dash all the other kingdoms, and everyone will worship me. Yeah.
So I really genuinely think every moral question that comes up, every moral choice you have is really, when you take it down to the atomic, not language, if you take it down to the atomic idea, what's the concept? The concept is, does God set what I should do, or do I set what I should do? That is always the choice between, is God in charge or am I in charge? If God's in charge, then you have to do whatever it is that you think, at a minimum, God wants you to do. And if it's not that God's in charge, then you are free to do whatever it is that you want to do. That's the question every single time.
On the other side, there's like schizophrenics that might see more moral choices than there are if they think, like, I have to make this many notes on a piece of paper, or my parents are going to die, or something bad is going to happen. In that case, are they free to, in a sense, ignore their moral conscience and, I guess, not do these things?
Or would you as, put yourself in God, if not God, and God's prosecutor, if you were God's prosecutor and responsible for bringing charges against somebody, would you care whether the person thought what they were doing was right, but were wrong about that? Or would you care whether they knew what was right or wrong more accurately, but chose the wrong? Like, do you care that they were wrong about what they thought was right? Is that an extenuating circumstance for you?
Yeah.
Okay, I think so too. And I think we all recognize, not we all, I think many people recognize that. And intent is very important. And so I think that God, Paul treats this, right? This guy thinks it's wrong. And so for him, it is wrong, is the way that he says it. Now, again, Paul uses extreme language very, very frequently. So, it is wrong. That's technically not correct. It's not wrong according to God, in that God didn't say don't do this thing, or God is okay with you doing this thing. But what he did say was, if the person thinks that, then for them it is sin. How does that make sense? How is it that Paul's not just become a relativist?
Paul or James?
Oh, did I say?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, James.
Says,
yes.
For he who knows to do good and does it not.
No, I'm thinking Paul and the eating of meats.
Yeah, you're talking about being staying kosher.
Yeah.
Because it goes against what your convictions are.
Yeah, but your convictions, which are purportedly based on what God says, right? So these are people who are doing that because they think God said to do this, not because they were just making it up. This was the person who says, like, no, like, God came down on the mountain in fire and thunder, and he said, here's the law, and the law says, don't eat this stuff, meat sacrificed to idols. And here's Paul being like, it's fine. And here's why it's fine, because God told Peter, don't call what's unclean, and that they worked it out in their minds that this was right. But some people were like, no, that's not right, I'm not going to do it. And Paul says, for them, it is sin. Why is it for them sin? I was just pointing Seth to say, Seth as prosecutor is going to try to form the two elements, this is human court, but the two elements of a crime, which is you got to have killed somebody and then you got to have meant to have done it. Mens rea plus the actual criminal action. So if you have the mens rea, but you never murder anybody. I want to, hey, yeah, I've had it with Mark. The man dies. I decide that in my mind, but I don't do it. You don't throw me in jail. If I accidentally kill Mark, but I didn't, I'm like, oh my goodness, he was my best friend. I didn't mean to do that. They don't give you murder one for that one, right? They give you murder one because you have the intent and you did the action. So if divine justice is anything close to that, then you need the intent, and the intent here is important. And the intent is based on knowledge. There have been enough people killed of like, this person did this bad thing, and so I killed them because they deserved it. Turns out they didn't do that bad thing. Then what does this person feel? Incredibly guilty, but incredibly guilty differently than they would feel if they did it without thinking the person had done some evil. Or maybe an obvious case of this one is blue on blue. And this happened in I think Desert Storm 2, where two tank units engaged with each other, and one tank unit practically wiped out the other one. It was good guys. It was good guys. Americans versus Americans, right? And I mean, you were cheering when your round went through the other tank and killed it. You're like, yeah, we got him. And then it turns out, no, you didn't. You just killed your buddy. So that changes the way that you view these things. Okay, I saw another hand that I think I ignored for a second.
Well, then what do you do with society or a lot of people that are causing harm, thinking they're doing good?
What do you think? So who's the best New Testament example of thought they were doing the right thing, was doing the wrong thing? Paul. What was the solution? Right. But what, I mean, categorically what happened?
Well, he disabled him until he could make the right choice.
Okay.
So maybe that includes locking people out.
Now, see, most people don't see this point, I don't think. But he took him off line from his ability to do that. Why is that important? Why is that important? Psychologically, why is that important?
It doesn't really say why, but it is an interesting.
Give him time to think about it. You put kids in time out.
But what does that do? What does it do for the person to do so? Like, presumably, if God had Ananias write a strongly worded letter to Paul and be like, let me show you scripturally where you're wrong about this. Paul's probability that he would, I think we all assume that Paul probably wouldn't respond well to that. Why did Paul respond well? Psychologically speaking, why did he respond to this?
Well, it's his response to, God knocking him off the bright light. You're talking about the blindness.
Oh, no, I'm talking, yeah, so that's true. I am talking about the blindness.
So, because it seems like he repented at, who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus who you're persecuting. I mean, that was the changing point, but yeah, why the blindness?
Actually, do we know that's the changing point?
You think it's when he was faithful?
I'm not saying I think that. I'm saying we don't know that's the changing point.
Oh.
So theoretically speaking, he could have turned around while laying on the ground after hearing the voice. Or it could have been that over the course of a few days of sitting there of like, what just happened?
But that's why the blindness.
And I think that the blindness was there for a number. I think that all of it was there for a very good reason. I think we ought to study this very, very deeply. Sometime maybe we will here.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But one of the things that goes on is when you get knocked off the horse and you hear Jesus say, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, it's tough for you to kick against the goads. And then you get up and you say like to everybody, you're like, did that just happen? And you say to Mark, hey, what just happened? He's like, yeah, I saw a flash of light, I heard a voice, but I heard a sound. But no, man, nobody was talking. And you go right off and everything's fine. What happens that night when you wake up the next day? You're just like, man, I must have been tired, or was I dehydrated, or did I hit my head when I fell off the horse? We don't know he fell off the horse, but did I hit my head? Why nobody? Hey, did you hear a voice? They're like, no, weird sound, man. I don't know what it was. We'll look for an explanation. When you wake up the next day and you're like, I can't see.
Yeah, some of it's authority and power. So
and
God
then
was showing, and he was also. There's no accident that.
Well, I'm talking about the psych. You're right about all that, but I'm talking about the psychological part. So
Yeah,
imagine you're
I
in
mean,
Paul's
right?
shoes
So
and you wake up and you're blind and you're still maybe like, did I hit my head too hard? Was there some weird atmospheric?
Yeah,
all
sure.
those things, and then how does it go away?
So there's a lot going
So
on.
what
there.
was Paul doing all this time? About what? So doesn't tell us, right? But maybe Paul's like, okay, I'm obeying what you said. I'm a son of the tribe of Benjamin. I circumcised on the 8th day. I'm your most I'm your biggest crusader here. Crusade was probably the wrong term, right? But I'm the guy who's doing what you want to do. And God's like, I'm telling you you're wrong about it. And Paul's like, I can't be wrong about it. I've memorized, I know the whole Pentateuch by heart. I'm not wrong about this. And he's like, you're wrong about this, and you're still blind. And finally, to certify that he's wrong about it, one of these Christians comes up and says, Paul, God, Jesus sent me here, and in the name of Jesus, this is very important, in the name of Jesus, I give you your sight. This is the certification that Paul needed. He needed the event, and that's just not it, or God would have left it at that. Right. He needed a couple days worth of thinking about it and praying about it, and then he needed, and this is Paul, like, is anybody here better than Paul? Like, don't we kind of like put Paul up there? Like, look, if I did as well as Paul, I'd probably be happy. You know, maybe we don't like all of Paul did, but like, I'd be happy to be as good. Thought if I was 1/10 as good as Paul, I would feel really, really good about that. But Paul needed days, and he needed to be left in unanswered prayer for days. Sure. And then the guy comes in and gives him the certification at the end of it. This is very important psychologically.
But he still had a choice.
Sure.
Out of everything that went on, when you get back to your original question, he still had a choice. He's getting all this sensory information, and he can't see.
I agree with you 100%. What I'm saying is the choice, what matters is that the question that got asked to start us down this track was, what do you do for the person that has the wrong information? And let's follow God's example. And the answer, and she was positing, like, put them in timeout. So one of the things you may have to do is stop them and throw them in prison. This is the reason people get converted in prison, right? They would not have stopped otherwise until you physically locked them in a cell of, like, think about what you're doing. And eventually they come around.
But isn't God acting to change your environment such that you will change your desires?
Is God acting to do that? Yeah, I think so.
We did the same thing to Noah. Now, he changed his environment such that Noah changed his desires real quick. You know, hey, I want to get out of this way real fast. So what do I have
for
to
Jonah,
do?
Yeah.
So he chooses to pray, or he chooses to repent a little bit.
Yeah, but let's go back to the main question that started us here this whole time. But here's here's the question. I agree they got choice. Like, I think I'm agreeing with you. The question is not just does he have choice. The question is, how free is that choice? If the choice is free enough, and then secondly, like the mobster question, because this came off the mobster question, if you dropped the same soul into different bodies, would they do the same thing? And my point about the mobster guy is, I don't know that your assumption that if I had not had a mobster as a father, that I would have basically ended up, he didn't say he would have ended up as a Christian. What he said was, in that interview, maybe he says it elsewhere, that maybe I wouldn't have become a Christian. Maybe it was this experience that drove him to then accept Christ. And he actually credits the wife that he married, technically his second wife, because his first one was different. But the second wife was was part of the decision, the main thrust of the decision of whether he needed to reform his life or not. And she was a Christian, and this had to do with his coming to Christ. So I guess the point I'm making is this. Back to my own philosophical worldview that says the world that you're sitting in is the best of all possible worlds. And what God has done is looked at all the ways the world could be, and he's instantiated it in such a way that he puts you or him in the mobster dad, not because he's worried that you're going to do mobster stuff, which you did do, but that in the long run, you came back to him. That God's interested in the long run. I'm not going to say he doesn't care, but he doesn't care that Paul had Stephen stoned, or that Paul approved of Stephen getting stoned. What he cares is, did Paul come back to him in the end? Because in this world view, where this happens, Paul gets Stephen and Paul. Where if he'd left Paul alone over here, maybe Paul wouldn't have come back his way. That's the idea, is that there are possible worlds, at least, where not everybody who could come to him does come to him. And my belief that derived from the category of God as being all loving drives God to choose what world he wants to instantiate, but whatever world he instantiates, he will instantiate for the purpose that he chose to bring the maximal number of people who possibly could come to him within those bounds.
So, going to the positive.
We got 5 more minutes, and then we're shutting down a little bit.
Paul, so God seemed to intervene in this situation. Basically, it was packing with some knowledge. Then,
well, and God intervenes Paul, that one obviously miraculously.
Yeah.
Is it God's intervention that he dropped you into the family that you were in? Who puts the soul in the body? Right? So technically it's all a miracle. And I forget who said this, so again, we'll steal it like it's mine. I know somebody else said it, but we act like miracles don't happen all the time. What is actually happening is the miraculous happens all the time, and we've just gotten accustomed and don't realize it's miraculous. Here's the example of that one. If it's the case, standard theological belief, God sustains the world in existence continually. If he did not sustain the world in existence, it would cease to exist. This is a standard Orthodox, small O Orthodox Christian belief. Think about that for a second. That means everything is a miracle.
So in the case, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the things that happen to Paul don't happen to everybody.
Don't. In what way?
In that they literally see Christ, they get
Okay, but
they get really
well. If you're talking about the things that happen to Paul don't happen to everybody. That's true of every single human everywhere. The things that happen to Chris don't happen to everybody. The things that happen to Mark don't happen to everybody. The things that happen to Katie don't happen.
Category of things that happen to Paul.
Which is what?
Which is, I guess, and maybe have to define miraculous intervention, but there's some sort of direct intervention that inhibits his faculties.
Now, what I will say is this: to Paul, a zealot of the highest order, he was inaccessible to any correction other than that, lesser than that. So for Paul, consider the following. Let's say it this way. God always interacts with people to give them at least the minimum amount necessary in order to give them the true choice to make the right choice. In Paul's case, in order to get him past the I know I'm doing the right thing, he was accessible to no smaller level of correction. Strongly worded letters, none of that was going to stop that guy. That guy was a juggernaut. This was the only thing that was going to stop him. For those of us that are not quite so insanely driven to do those kinds of things, we're accessible to less, maybe directly, obviously miraculous things. That actually doesn't stop them from being miraculous. The fact that this person shows up into your life, we say this all the time, it was divine intervention. I'd expect this person just showed up and this thing happened. Okay, so what I would point out is, in the worldview that I hold, God sends stuff that we're like, oh, that's everyday and mundane. Did it allow you the ability to see what was actually right and wrong here? Yeah, I see what's right and wrong. Okay, that's all Paul needed. When he saw what was right, he did it. But he needed to see what was right. If you get to the point where you see what's right and wrong, you are at Paul's point. It just didn't take a miracle to get you there. So God doesn't do unnecessary miracles. He doesn't do gratuitous miracles. He does purposeful miracles. And the purpose of the miracles are always to show people the choice that they need to make. For Israel versus Baal, it was showing who's actually God, who's the top God. For Paul, it was showing who was actually the Messiah. For Peter, it's showing what laws you're supposed to follow or not follow, or what is loyal and not loyal, that kind of thing. Michael, and we'll close on this one.
I want to go out on a mere pushback against the view of setting identity solely in the metaphysics, solely in the spirit side of the body. I think if you're going to say that, you can have a theology that says that we humans are embodied souls and that we want to value both the body and the soul.
Yes.
Then we can't, I like the Freaky Friday analogies because I think we can all readily imagine them and recognize them.
Yes.
But can you legitimately make these Freaky Friday claims where we can just pluck someone out of
All
the
right,
body?
so I haven't told you what my viewpoint is yet on all of this,
Okay.
but I'll point this out to you right here. Imagine a video game maybe where you can pick what trooper you're going to send into this battle. But you know about this battle that it is a long-range battle with very little cover between enemy and you. So you have your close-range assault trooper who's real stronger than everybody else. You have your recce trooper who's really good. And then you got your sniper. And if you understand warfare at this point, you're like, I would select the sniper, whatever, character to be the guy in there because they're going to do the best in all this. So it actually turns out that for that given environment, for you who know the tactics of what to do, you would choose the sniper character because it will accomplish what you think the goal is. You are the one who is going to drop the will. In this case, the will could be the same will that could drop in any of these shells. But for what you want to accomplish, you drop that shell in there. This may be reflective of the shells that you're sitting in. You may be a lady who can get pregnant now because whatever it is that God wanted for you, it comes through these sets of experiences. I could have been this lunatic that I am because whatever God wanted to teach me, I needed to sit in this shell in order to learn it in the environment that I get in there. I think that I won't say where I sit on all this yet, but that this has to do, that the shell matters. Now the question is, does the shell matter only for God's choice, or does the shell matter for our choices too? I leave that one to you. But I actually think that with the data that we've got today, that we're now at the point where everything on the table is an answer. I'll remind you that is able to generate an answer. I'll remind you of the other key consideration that we talked about today. One of them is like, which shell do we go into? A second one was, how free are we to make the choices that we can make that in the society, in the place in which we find ourselves. The third part is, are there any choices that we're not free to make? And I think the answer to that is no. So I will say, if you set that one to no, then the question we want to ask on identity is, how much we are reactive to all of our choices. Are we reactive solely to existence, or are we reactive to existence plus some other set? Now the size of that set is going to matter. And then the last question is there anything that we're making choices on that is not reactive? So you can't make an argument reasonably that we're reactive to anything that doesn't count existence, right? We find ourselves in existence, we have to react to that. Technically, God's in the same boat, unless he could, remember, because he exists necessarily. So he doesn't react to the fact of his own existence. He is acting because there is no for him to react to. But we didn't have to exist. We do exist, which means that we have to react to the fact that we're contingent. The reaction to contingency is the ground of belief in God. Like that ought to get you there alone, which is why the contingency argument is one of the most least appreciated arguments out there. But are we when you have the answer to these questions, you have your answer. We're reacting to existence, obviously we have to be. Are we reacting to something other than existence? Are we reacting to God-given things? Is there anything that we can choose that is not reactive, other than in virtue of being that we exist? So are we only reactive to things that God gave us, or can we, like God, act in a way that is not reactive? These presumably can form the core of our identity, and we need to figure out what those are. And once we do that, now we've got something that we can say about the essential properties of identity. So that's what we'll start next time. Sufficiently confusing and philosophical for you?
Can you put that in a sentence or two?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you what you react to, or are you who you set for yourself? And if it's both, then how much?
It seems like a false dichotomy.
Right. Okay, then what's the third? If it's a false dichotomy, what's the third option? Technically that was A. Technically that was A or not A, so it can't be a false dichotomy. There's a law of the excluded middle on that one.
All right, so regardless of that,
yes,
I think you're saying, are you what you react to, and in order to react, you must be something.
Yes.
So just by virtue of that, you have an issue you have not added that as a possibility. You're saying, are you what you react to? Well, yeah. No, because you had to be something in order to react. So there must be a priori.
And that was where I was saying, this was you're reacting to existence. So you have to react to existence.
You have to react to existence. However, that is still a priority that there must be something to react to existence.
I agree with that. I'm saying beyond that one, is there anything else?
Okay.
That's the second category. So that one, you have to. You're stuck with reacting to that one. Is everything else that you choose is everything about your identity only in reaction to things that are set for you, or do you get to do anything?
So I'm reacting to the fact that you're reacting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I think there must be something that is there so that it can react, right?
Must be less more than
Take two
40%.
chemicals,
Yes.
you can have a reaction, but you don't have a reaction unless there's a chemical first, right?
Yeah, but to
And
me,
that
that's this
chemical
category.
must have characteristics and tendencies, and therefore when forced with an exterior force, or when exposed to an exterior force, it can react.
Not in a world where you were born a man, but you can legitimately turn yourself mentally into the point where you're a woman, and you don't
So that's a
differ
reaction.
essentially anyway.
Is that not a reaction?
But it allows you to reject. Yeah, it's a reaction.
Yeah, so there must have been something there prior to.
And I'm asking, is that the only set of things you can do is react? You're making the argument that you are all reaction. I'm asking the question. I'm not saying that it's okay.
I'm actually saying the opposite.
Okay, well then.